Welcome everyone to the Canadian Diabetes Association's 2016 webinar series. My name is Farah Ismail and I'm a program manager for the CDA and I will be your host for today. We are delighted that you're able to join us for a webinar to learn about how to take charge of type 1 diabetes. To start off, I'd like to draw your attention to our survey. It's located at the top right-hand section of your screen. So in order for CDA to better serve your needs, we kindly ask you provide us with your input by completing the short survey towards the end of the presentation. And we thank you in advance for your input. Now, throughout the presentation, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. So this can be done by simply typing in the question and answer box, and that's located to the bottom right-hand section of your screen. And our presenter will be happy to respond to the questions at the end of the presentation. Today, we'll also be displaying a few polling questions throughout the presentation and would love for your participation. I'd also like to note that your answers will remain completely anonymous. Also note that you're able to customize your screens to expand or collapse them as you see fit, so feel free to adjust them by simply dragging down the bottom right-hand corner of each of the webinar pods. Our presentation today will last about 40 to 45 minutes in length, and we'll have about another 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions. Today's presentation will be recorded and made available on our CDA website. So now I'd like to welcome our speaker, Julie Halipchuk, and thank her for joining us today. But before turning it over to Julie, I'd like to give you a brief introduction. Julie works as a clinical nurse specialist at the Diabetes Education Resource for Children and Adolescents at the Children's Hospital in Winnipeg. Her shared interests include both type 1 and type 2 diabetes in youth, with her true passion stemming from the privilege of working with youth and their families to fit diabetes into their lives. For more information on Julie, please read the speaker bio section, and that's located to the left of your screen. So without further ado, I present to you Julie.
Hello everyone and greetings from Winnipeg. I am honored that you've chosen to spend a little bit of your time this evening here with me talking about type 1 diabetes. We're having beautiful weather in Winnipeg and I hope the rest of you are as well. We're going to start the presentation this evening, which is a little bit different than me, I will admit, in that I can't see you or hear you. So this questionnaire is helpful for me to understand who I'm talking to in the audience tonight. So if you could take a moment to, with your mouse, just click on one of the options you see on your screen to answer how you are affected by diabetes, and perhaps that might tell us what's drawing you to the presentation here tonight. I'll just give you a couple seconds to do that. Okay, so let's see who's here today. So it looks like we have about 44% of the participants are coming as healthcare professionals, 24% are parents of a child that has diabetes, and equal amounts who are listening in that have type 1 and who have type 2 diabetes. And then 16% other, so I'm not sure what the other is, but I'm hopeful that the presentation tonight will meet all of your needs stemming from all of your interests. A next question to ask is, how are you participating today? And this will give the Canadian Diabetes Association a bit of a feel for the numbers of people participating in the webinar tonight. So are you logged on just yourself at the screen? Is there a group of 2 to 5 people listening and watching, or a group of 6 or more? Okay, so again, we've got lots of individual participants and a few in a group of 2 or more. Thanks for doing that. Okay, now we'll launch into what I hope will be the meat of the presentation today. So when I was given the objectives for today's presentation, sort of a mixed request, and really I think to help understand both people living with diabetes, and especially people supporting others who are living with diabetes, in all their questions related to type 1. So this slide sort of shows many of the questions that I will see people asking and wondering at the first point of a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes when they come into our office. And I'm hopeful that tonight's presentation will answer many of those questions for you. The objectives of my presentation will be to indeed answer the question, what is type 1 diabetes and how does it arise? We'll talk about the signs and symptoms of type 1. We'll also address the differences between type 1 and type 2 to clarify some of the differences in treatment and supports that those diseases need. We'll learn about hypoglycemia or low blood sugar, talking about how to prevent it, how to treat it. We'll talk about sick day management. Also a bit of a discussion on how the normal stages of development through the ages and lifespan, how those stages of development may impact diabetes management. I also want to explore some very common emotional responses to a diagnosis of type 1 and offer some strategies to support those emotions. Finally, then, we'll discuss some options for support that can be accessed while living with type 1 diabetes. And so first off, to answer the question, what is type 1 diabetes, I think it's useful to start with a bit of an explanation of basic glucose metabolism, or what's happening in the body in that how do we use and process sugar. So normally in the body, we take food into our stomach. Food is broken down mainly into one of three things, either fat or protein or sugar. The carbohydrates that break down into the glucose, that glucose is then absorbed into the bloodstream and carried to the cells of our body. And on the screen you see those cells as the green circles. We'll often refer to those cells as our gas tanks. So our bodies are made up of many, many gas tanks or many, many cells, and each of those cells requires glucose as their gas to help the body be fueled and have energy. Once the sugar is reaching the bloodstream, there's a magical balance that happens where the pancreas makes insulin and secretes that insulin into the bloodstream. The insulin will meet the sugar at the doors to the cells, or the receptors, where insulin is used as the key. So we really do call it a key that unlocks the doors to those cells to let the sugar go into the cell or gas tank so that it can be used for fuel for the body. And that process is just happening whenever we eat, or really all day long. We're making and using insulin in order to allow us to utilize the sugar or glucose that comes into our body for energy. And then the cells break down that energy. So there's a picture there of some happy cells. Now, what changes with diabetes? Well, the glucose still is digested and reaches the bloodstream. But then, for some reason, the glucose can't enter the cells, either as easily or not at all. The first reason that might happen, where the glucose can't go into the cells, is when insulin is not produced. And that is specific to type 1 diabetes, which is our main focus for tonight. It also could be that there is insulin being produced, but the insulin doesn't open the cell doors quite as easily or as quickly, and that would be the case of insulin resistance, which some of you may have already heard of. Another thing that can happen with diabetes would be that there may be too few receptors on those cells or gas tanks, so too few doors for the sugar part of me to go into, or there might be too little insulin being produced. And this would be an example of what's going on in type 2 diabetes. So I just wanted to clarify those differences in what does change. It's different reasons why the sugar can't get in, but mainly, again, draw the focus back to type 1, where we're looking at the fact that in the body, no insulin is produced when type 1 diabetes is present, and so that sugar is unable to get into the cells of the body. And so what happens is the sugar stays in the bloodstream, building up to very high levels, or hyperglycemia, or high blood sugar, and then the body is not happy at all. So what happens when we have high amounts of sugar floating around in our blood? And these are the symptoms that would lead to a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes. So one of the most common symptoms of high blood sugar would be frequent urination, or going to the bathroom to pee very, very often. This is hugely interruptive to people's day. It's going to the bathroom all the time in order to get the sugar out of their body. in turn, because you're going to the bathroom so much to get rid of all that sugar, you're also losing a lot of fluid, which then creates a very, very intense thirst. And that is the body's way of trying to fix the dehydration that's going on from all the water that's being lost. This thirst is really a crazy thirst. So this may be where you'll see I've had toddlers who have been caught drinking out of mud puddles or garden hoses because they're just so thirsty and they can't explain that. I've had, teenagers or children who their parents find them standing at the fridge door chugging from the jugs of milk nonstop because they just can't get enough fluid into them. Getting up in the night to drink, getting up in the night to pee, very common when we're having high blood sugars for long periods present. But also, as I mentioned, might be common to be getting up in the nighttime to go to the bathroom. This will sometimes even lead to bedwetting, and this would be bedwetting in someone who it wasn't typical for them to bedwet. So again, we may have young people or even adults who haven't wet the bed in years and years, but because their body's trying to rid themselves of so much sugar and make so much urine, they end up having accidents either in the daytime or nighttime. We also might see some weight loss despite having had a very large appetite. So this means they're eating lots, but the weight is still falling off. And again, this is because if we can't get the sugar into the cells of the body, there is no energy there. The body needs energy, so it will then burn off its fat stores to give energy and result in some weight loss. Because of that lack of sugar in the cells, we do see a decreased energy. People will often be very tired, even lethargic. Some will complain of blurred vision when their blood sugars have been high for a period of time, often leading up to diagnosis. That blurred vision is usually related to, again, the high amounts of sugar and the corresponding dehydrated state where they're lacking in fluid in their body. We usually do see this sort of temporary blurred vision resolve once the blood sugars settle out early after diagnosis. And the final symptom that you might see in a really late stage in times of high blood sugars is true lethargy, vomiting. They may have what we call acetone breath, which can be sort of a fruity smelling breath. These are all signs of diabetic ketoacidosis. This is a state where because the blood sugars have been high for so long and the cells have been empty of sugar and therefore needing to burn off fat for energy, what results when we burn off fat for energy are something called ketones. Now, ketones are acids. The brain doesn't like acid, and so it really essentially tries to shut down. The only way to fix this is often IV fluids, and insulin is what's needed. So this is a state that can sometimes happen at diagnosis because the people didn't know that they had diabetes. They didn't yet know they needed insulin, and so once it's recognized and insulin started, this will resolve quite nicely. So one more little interactive survey here as we keep going in the presentation. So this is a little bit to see what kind of knowledge you're coming into the presentation with. So click your mouse, if you will. Which of the buttons that you see do you think reflect type 1 diabetes? So is it an autoimmune disease? Are people born with high-risk genes? Is there an absolute need for insulin? Or all of the above? I'll give you a few seconds to think about that. Okay, hopefully you've had a minute to choose some of those. All right, so 72.7% are indeed correct. It was all of the above. The autoimmune disease, you are correct also, obviously, and yes, there is an absolute need for insulin. And we'll talk about the high-risk gene piece in just a moment. So what causes type 1 diabetes? How do we get to the place of having all these symptoms that we've just talked about? So it is indeed an autoimmune disease where the immune system seems to make a mistake. It seems, for whatever reason, it decides that the cells of the pancreas that make insulin are foreign to the body. The immune system essentially turns on itself and attacks all those cells that make insulin. And it will do this until the point where there is a complete inability for the body to make insulin. So you'll see further down, the beta cells that make insulin are destroyed. We believe that through the research that people are born with their risk of developing diabetes already present, so these high-risk genes that are present, but not all of the people with those high-risk genes will ever get type 1 diabetes. Not everyone with those risks will have this autoimmune response in their body that leads to a lack of insulin. For those who do develop type 1 diabetes, there is some sort of precipitating event or a trigger that causes the immune system to make that mistake and to turn and attack the cells that make insulin. We don't fully understand what that precipitating event is. Some theories are that there may have been an illness or a fever that caused the immune systems to turn in that direction. But we're not sure. Even if we think we could have pinpointed when the event started, we don't yet know how to interfere with that process. What we do know is that all of those symptoms that I mentioned that are representative of high blood sugar, those will show themselves typically when the body is down to only about 10% of the cells left able to make insulin. And at that point in time, we start to see the symptoms of a high blood sugar because the body can no longer keep up with the food coming in. The sugars go high, the symptoms present, a diagnosis of diabetes is made, and at that time, we then are able to note that we need absolutely insulin for the rest of their lives. It is important to understand that type 1 diabetes is not at all related to lifestyle. We don't believe it's related to what did or didn't happen early in the child's life or in the pregnancy. Again, we believe that it's an autoimmune response caused by some sort of triggering event. So just a moment to discuss some of the differences between type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So you've got what we've just mentioned on the left side with type 1 diabetes. It's much smaller numbers in the world, and so sometimes less well understood by the world. 10% of the diabetes population in the world approximately have type 1 diabetes versus 90% of the diabetes population of the world having type 2 diabetes. So it's pretty common that when someone will say, I have diabetes, the assumption to the people around them may be, oh, that's it's the diabetes, like type 2 diabetes, because that's the one more people understand. They then may make some assumptions about how it's treated or how it's managed. We know that type 2 diabetes, they do still make insulin, although they may make less insulin, or they may be a bit resistant in that the insulin that they do make doesn't work quite as well to open those cell doors. There are many treatment options available for type 2 diabetes versus only insulin as the treatment for type 1. And most commonly, there is a family history of type 2 diabetes for the person who is newly diagnosed. It is sometimes related to inactivity and obesity, but I will say that not always is this the case for those individuals diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. I think that's important to note and understand. I'm presenting here some common false perceptions, and these would be responses that I see typically of people coming into my office when they're first diagnosed with type 1, and also some of the responses my families will tell me that they have thrown at them when they're out and about and say, my child has diabetes, and these are some of the assumptions that people make. So these are false for sure, but some of the perceptions out there would be, I can no longer eat sugar. I must diet. I can control this disease, type 1 diabetes, with exercise. And another one, I caused this by eating too much. So I've had many family members over the years who have been told by others, oh yeah, I did think you let him eat too much McDonald's, or I thought you let him drink too many Slurpees. A fairly common response that people have faced, unfortunately. And so they end up putting on their happy face or their fake smile sometimes and nodding, thank you for that information, and carrying on with their day. For hopefully, if you are living with type 1 diabetes, supporting people with type 1 diabetes, you do already understand that these perceptions are false. You've taken a great step to supporting those people and participating today to further your understanding of type 1 diabetes. So let's talk some more specifics about what type 1 diabetes looks like in a person's day. So there's lots of gadgets galore. Technology is moving in all sorts of interesting directions with the technology that's available to help manage type 1 diabetes. I'm not going to focus specifically on any of these products or the new developments, but you may be interested in the webinar that's coming on June 1st, which will talk specifically about what's new with diabetes technology and device. And there have been some really cool developments of recent. Those gadgets, though, are essential. So no matter whether they're the older ones or the newest cutting-edge monitors, they are needed to keep people healthy and active with type 1 diabetes. So an important part of the management is blood glucose monitoring. This is done a minimum of 4 times per day, a minimum of breakfast, lunch, supper, and bedtime before those meals. It is important to understand that those numbers are not a report card. There are no good or bad blood sugar numbers at all. Simply, we say to families that those blood sugars are a roadmap that help families make decisions about what to do with their insulin doses, about what to do with their activity levels, and what to do with the food that they eat. So they're really, really a helpful tool. And none of those numbers should be punished or feared. We do base the blood sugar goals. We set targets for the families. The Canadian Diabetes Association set forth some guidelines in their 2013 practice guidelines, and those are the ones you see here on your screen. So you'll see that in the younger age group, the blood sugar targets are a little bit higher, and that's really because children of those younger ages were worried about the risk of low blood sugars for them because their brain is still so in such a stage of development, and also we can't rely on them to either acknowledge their lows, be aware of their lows, or to help treat those lows. At about age 6, we start to tighten those targets to about 4 to 10. Again, getting the blood sugar targets a little more tighter, in a tighter range, for the sake of long-term health. And by age 13, we're starting to encourage individuals to tighten those up a little bit more even. I will say, though, that those are just guidelines and that they do need to be individualized. So I may have a 10-year-old patient and their family who are really wanting to keep their blood sugars in the 4 to 8 range, and so they create that as their goal. We would work with them to support them in that goal because they want to be there, they're capable of doing so. On the flip side, I may have a teenager who is struggling to keep their blood sugars anywhere between about 6 to 10 perhaps, and that may be a realistic goal for them at that age and stage of their life. And so again, we work with them to support them in that. And I should really need to mention that no matter what the goal is, with type 1 diabetes, not all of the blood sugars will ever realistically be in that goal. It's absolutely normal for the blood sugars to fluctuate throughout the day and throughout the week. What we do with those blood sugars helps us to decide how to structure the insulin doses and the amounts of insulin given. So there's different plans of insulin, different types of insulin that can be used to manage diabetes, or manage type 1 diabetes specifically, but the goal is to pick a plan that fits most well with the individual's day and their schedule. We try hard not to pick a plan and say, okay, change your life to match this. Instead, we try to explore the individual's life and their schedule, their sleep habits, their eating schedule, and pick a plan that fits best into that schedule. So really, again, trying to fit diabetes into the life that they are having and wanting to have. So we match injected insulin to try to mimic or we say think like a pancreas. So we're trying to do what the body would normally do if the pancreas were functioning and producing insulin. So every time you eat, as you see in this picture, someone's eating 3 meals, breakfast, lunch, and supper, and each time they eat and intake carbohydrates, you see a rise in their blood sugar following that meal. So we know that in our background, we always need some background insulin helping us out for all our just basic functioning. And then we also need a rise or a peak of insulin to capture the sugar that's rising from the meal we've just eaten. So there'd be different plans to do that. We have, again, we also have insulin pumps or another way to administer insulin. But again, whatever plan the patient is on, there's truly not one plan that's better than the other. I feel very strongly that the best plan for giving insulin is the one that fits best into your life. And I see that week after week in that in reflection in the blood sugars and the A1C, that target blood sugars can be achieved if the plan is the one that's most suitable to your day. This is a picture that shows the balancing act that people with type 1 diabetes are living and breathing every day, all day. So we've got in front of you a teeter-totter, and what I like to show is that there's 3 things on that teeter-totter of type 1 diabetes that are affecting the blood sugar each and every day. On the left, you have carbohydrates, or sugar, which raise the blood sugar higher. On the other side, you have 2 items that decrease the blood sugar. I being insulin, so insulin will lower the amount of sugar in the blood, as will exercise. And so we won't go into too many examples for the sake of time, but I want you to understand that a change in any one of these 3 things can tip the balance in the blood sugars. And so we always are trying to compensate on the other side of the teeter-totter proactively, or trying to prevent the high or prevent the low when we know what's coming up ahead of us. And truly this is easier said than done. So it's one thing if you know Tuesday nights the person with diabetes has a soccer game and they can make a plan for that. But then there's all the spontaneous activities that come about, and it may be that you've already given your insulin, you've already eaten your meal, and so it's difficult to react or plan for that situation spontaneously. And so families are taught to react to those changes in plans to hopefully try to keep the blood sugar in a range that's suitable for them. This is just a little comic that says, you kids today with your fancy buttons and insulin on board. In my day, a person with diabetes had to walk 10 miles in the snow for just 1 injection. So just a little sort of comic at the fact. I think it pokes nicely, though, at the fact that we have a lot of developments in technology and really a lot of great changes and advances in the last few years related to living with type 1 diabetes. I'll show you a quick example of a typical day in the life of someone with type 1 diabetes. So might start out 7:30 in the morning, we check a blood sugar, take insulin, have breakfast. At 10 o'clock, we'll do a snack, and then at noon, another blood sugar check and lunch. 3 o'clock, another snack. 6 o'clock, check the blood sugar, have insulin, have supper. And then before you know it, 9 o'clock, check blood sugar, insulin, and a bedtime snack again. That would be a pretty common plan for someone living with type 1. And then we look at the blood sugars associated with that. So 7:30, maybe the blood sugar was 7.4 when they woke. 10 o'clock in the morning, 21.6, probably a little high because they had their breakfast earlier. And then they eat their usual snack. At noon, the blood sugar is down to 8.6. 3 o'clock, blood sugar goes to 2.9. Looks like they had an active gym class. 6 o'clock, blood sugar is 15.3. Perhaps they gave too much sugar for the low-end gym. And then 9 o'clock, the blood sugar is down to 9.5. So the start of the day looks reasonable, the end of the day looks reasonable, and in between you have a range and a fluctuation of blood sugars that is typical of type 1 diabetes. And then it just reminds us that we can't look at those blood sugars of a report card and say they did a bad job or they did do a good job of that whole day. So hypoglycemia or low blood sugar, that's what was happening when in the example during or just following gym class. So many people will feel low at different levels. So it's not that a blood sugar of 3 is worse than a blood sugar a blood sugar of 2, is worse than a blood sugar of 3. We say that anything less than 4 is a low blood sugar. It's much more urgent than a high blood sugar or hyperglycemia, and the treatment for a low blood sugar must be immediate. These are some pictures of the symptoms of what someone might look like if they're experiencing a low blood sugar. I would say that a low blood sugar is a normal nuisance, unfortunately, of living with type 1 diabetes. Again, no matter how amazing of a job you're doing in managing diabetes, these low blood sugars will still happen. I hope that they aren't happening more than 2 times a week. If they are happening more frequently, I think that you should be reaching out to your diabetes team, perhaps changing some of your insulin doses or the way you're managing activity. The lows, although we do have to put up with them a bit, I really do understand that they can impact your day and have such an interference in activities and enjoyment. So we do want to try to prevent them when we can. What you might see with someone with a low, they may get trembling or shakiness. Some will complain of blurred vision or dizziness. Sweating, this is where you break into like a cold sweat even though you're not doing any activities. Extreme tiredness and paleness. Some might complain of hunger or headaches. Now, both hunger and headaches can also be associated with just being out there, right? You could just be hungry. And also, same thing with mood changes. So we can't say that every mood change is because of a low blood sugar, because we all probably know people without diabetes who have mood changes as well. But these are some of the common signs that a person might show if they were feeling low. If these signs were happening and you weren't sure if it was a low, we would want to do an extra blood sugar test to confirm if that blood sugar is indeed less than 4. I would say that sometimes these symptoms can actually also be representative of a high blood sugar. So we wouldn't want to give sugar assuming that it's a low, because then they'd go even higher. So it is important to confirm with a finger poke what the blood sugar may be. Often children, all individuals, can recognize their symptoms of a low blood sugar and hopefully treat that low blood sugar. It is concerning if people have lows and they have no awareness of that. And again, that's something you can reach out to your diabetes team, acknowledge that you're not feeling your lows, and hopefully work towards creating a plan that will help you recognize those low blood sugar symptoms. The treatment of a low is about 10 to 15 grams of carbohydrate, depends on the size of your body typically, which might look like about 7 Lifesavers, a small juice box. The regular size juice boxes could run in the 24-gram range of sugar, perhaps 4 glucose tablets, or even 1 fruit to go. Those are examples of what people might carry with them to treat their low blood sugar. So just to sort of look quickly at the steps to address a low blood sugar, those who are living with diabetes have probably already been taught this, and those who are working in diabetes probably teach this often, so I apologize if I'm, if you already know this, but our steps would be recognize the symptoms of a low, confirm if that blood sugar is indeed less than low by finger poke, treat quickly with fast sugar, simple carbohydrates that will digest quickly to relieve the symptoms of a low. Wait about 15 minutes and then retest to ensure that the blood sugars come up above 4 and retreat if needed. Some guidelines will emphasize eating right following that low and eating food that contains carbohydrate and protein. I do find that recommend varies from program to program across Canada, so just check with your program what their recommend is, whether they want you to eat following a low blood sugar or not. And that would be food in addition to the initial treatment for the low. Glucagon is something I just wanted to talk a little bit about as well that goes with type 1 diabetes. So glucagon is a naturally occurring hormone found in all our bodies that's produced by the pancreas. Its job is to stimulate the liver or wake up the liver to release glucose into the bloodstream when we're running low on sugar. So this is something that does normally happen, but we can't rely on it quite as readily when someone is dependent on injected insulin. And so for those people who are taking insulin, this is something that we'll encourage them to have on hand for the people who support them to use. It's given if you have a severe low blood sugar that leaves you unable to eat or drink or swallow, and essentially then there's no other way to get sugar into you, and so you wouldn't give this injection yourself, but your family members might. They would get the glucagon ready. It needs to be mixed, and then it's given by injection into the body. It will stimulate the liver to release some sugar and help the blood sugar rise up enough that the person would become more awake and conscious, and then they could get some sugar in by mouth. It's really only used in emergency treatments, and again, it's not something that the individual could give themselves or would necessarily carry with them all the time. Hope everyone's doing okay and they're hanging in there. Our time's going quickly. I just want to talk a little bit about sick day management. So someone living with type 1 diabetes shouldn't get sick more often. They will, though, find probably that when they experience a sick day like a flu, vomiting illness, diarrhea, it can make diabetes more difficult to manage, absolutely. So imagine taking insulin for the food that you've eaten, and then all of a sudden that food comes back up. You're left with insulin working in your body, and you're not able to keep anything down. The key to managing a sick day would be to check your blood sugar frequently. We often think that the blood sugars are going to go low because we can't keep food in our system, but sometimes they'll go high from the illness. Remember that you always need insulin with type 1 diabetes, even if you're not keeping any food down. You might not need enough, but you will still need some to keep your body well. If you can get any carbohydrates in when there's insulin in the body, do try. Sometimes it's sipping on popsicles or a little bit of 7-Up, sucking on candies just to get tiny amounts of carbs to go in and stay in. And ketones can certainly develop very, very fast when you're sick, and so we do encourage individuals to check for ketones every time the blood sugar is above 14 when you're feeling unwell. If you have more questions about sick days, it is something I would ask your diabetes team about because they'll be able to help you with that. And it can be really scary going through your first sick day when it's vomiting or diarrhea illness for sure and you're on insulin. One of the questions often asked me is, what about exercise? They have diabetes, don't they have to exercise lots? That's what they've read everywhere. So just sort of a quick comment on that. I would say we can all benefit from physical activity, whether we have type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, or no diabetes at all. It's good for all of us. But I would encourage you to ask yourself, what might exercise or how might exercise impact someone who has type 1 diabetes? Remember that teeter-totter. So exercise lowers the blood sugar. And what precautions should be taken? Yes, exercise is great for people living with type 1 diabetes, as it is for everyone. But indeed, there's some extra considerations and some extra work that needs to go in and around being physically active. Another thing I wanted to talk about is looking at the normal stages of development, and for us to consider how might those very normal stages of development that change throughout the ages impact diabetes management. And in order to answer that question, I want you to first think about those tasks that people have to do to live well with type 1 diabetes. So think for a second, what are all those tasks? Finger pokes, injections, many, many tasks that go along with that. And then look at the age groups on the screen and consider how those tasks might fit in with those age groups or not fit in. And I think we really need to understand that this question is much more than just a comment on what age can they check their own blood sugar or do their own injection. It's more about asking, Can they, the toddler or the school ager, open a juice box to treat a low? Can they, the teenager, remember to check their blood sugar when they go out with friends and are trying alcohol for the very first time? Or what about the young adult? What if they have a bad low blood sugar in the middle of the night when they move away to university and live on their own for the very first time? Or what if, as an adult, a new mom has a low blood sugar when she's up all night caring for her newborn? And then later, how will the individual living with type 1 diabetes, look after their own diabetes when they become that busy mom looking after their own busy family? And so on it goes as the life cycles continue. So I think when you ask those questions and when you try to imagine those scenarios, you will be trying to take steps to understand the lifelong journey of type 1 diabetes and how the challenges change throughout the age groups, and our support needed for those age groups is different. There are definitely some common emotional responses to a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes. A diagnosis with symptoms is made very quickly. So last night I had a family who was diagnosed in the emergency department around 10:30 at night. They were in my office by 9 o'clock this morning being taught how to give insulin injections to their young child. It's very quick turnaround to processing the diagnosis and doing the tasks to keep their child alive. And so that quick adjustment needed is really facing a new way of life and a new reality. And families will often exhibit responses that are commonly associated with grief, so anger, guilt, blame, sadness, frustration, shock, and fear. And it is essential in order to adjust to life with diabetes, to try to work through these normal emotional responses. And so if you're looking for successes to living a healthy and full life with type 1 diabetes, my advice would be to try to partner with your diabetes team. See them as on your side and part of your support system. Build your diabetes circle of supportive people who understand and respect all of your daily challenges. They'll be the ones who can really support you in your daily needs. Do try to acknowledge when you're struggling or when life is making it difficult to do diabetes. So if our lives are so busy or feeling so overwhelming, it's going to be really hard to fit diabetes in that. Talk about that. I think your healthcare team will understand. And try to seek out emotional support when needed. We talk openly about things called diabetes burnout, when people just get tired of the work of diabetes. Talk about that, reach out for support. It's out there for you, and I think it's important to acknowledge that we get that you may at times need that support with all that you're enduring. And how can you best support someone living with type 1 diabetes? Well, if you're here for that reason today, I commend you, because I think that people with type 1 diabetes get very frustrated when people misunderstand their diabetes or what they have to do to stay healthy. So my advice to you, that question would be listen, observe, and learn. Encourage all their efforts. Celebrate their strengths. And remember, these individuals are not only about diabetes. There's so much more to them. Try to support parents while they support their children or their family members, and truly help them reach for the stars. And so on that note, I think we can open it up to questions, and I will say thank you to each of you for logging in tonight. I hope that you've learned something, or maybe we've answered some of your questions. And again, I hope you'll be able to support people living with type 1 diabetes. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie. Thanks for that very educational webinar today. We've had a lot of people on our question and answer board that have already said that they're really excited about this information and to have access to it. So thanks so much today for presenting for us. We will move on to questions, just as you said. So I'll start us off here with our first question. Our participant has said, my son is over 20 and recently diagnosed. What is the best way to keep him safe if he drinks alcohol? What can I do to make sure he's safe if he has some alcoholic beverages with his friends?
Sure. That's a fabulous question. Thanks so much for asking that. I spend a lot of my day actually talking about alcohol. You might be surprised. So we know that alcohol, it can be, it's often consumed socially, and certainly someone with type 1 diabetes can consume alcohol very safely. What's interesting to understand is that even though many alcoholic beverages will have a lot of sugar or carbohydrates in them, that sugar will be digested, raise the blood sugar up, and then once the alcohol is busy getting processed by the body, the blood sugar will actually fall down or drop too low. So people who are consuming alcohol, what it looks like is an initial perhaps higher blood sugar and then a dramatic drop in their blood sugar in the hours to follow. So knowing that, we can prepare for that. What we'll say to young people who aren't yet very familiar with how alcohol affects their body, they may not be totally in control of that sort of social drinking that can happen, is to play it safe. So to play it safe and be safe while you're consuming alcohol is to err on the side of having a higher blood sugar. So we would say, don't take insulin for the carbohydrates in the beverage you're consuming. Let the blood sugar rise, and then there hopefully won't be concerns when it drops low later. We'll also say have something to eat, again, as an extra buffer in the body for when the alcohol is being processed. And we wouldn't want someone who's been drinking alcohol to go to bed and sleep the night away, to sort of, in quotes, I would say, sleep it off. If people can have sort of a buddy system, so say it's a young adult living away from home, if they can have some sort of system where either someone wakes them to check their blood sugar, or they make sure they check their blood sugar and eat before they go to bed, someone wakes them up to check on them in the morning, that's really, truly ideal. And I think that over time, as people become more familiar with the effect of alcohol in their body, they start to figure out that fine balance between how much insulin is needed in order to not go too high, but again, to make sure they don't drop too low in the hours that follow. Hope that's helpful.
Great. Thank you so much for that response. I'll move on to our next question. Our participant has said, my son is 5, and one day he's very active, and the next day not so much. How do you accommodate for random child play? And also, how do you calculate for activity or exercise?
Okay, that's a great question, and certainly 5-year-olds are tons of fun and very busy, but then might be also laying on the couch. So it is tricky to do for sure, that exercise piece. Pardon me. One general rule of thumb, so if you know that the activity is going to happen following a meal, we will often work with families to try to reduce the insulin that's given at that meal time so that less insulin covers the food, and then you rely on some of the exercise or activity after the meal to sort of burn off the rest of the sugar. So that's one way to do it. But when it's spontaneous exercise and it wasn't planned, you may have already given the insulin, and then say the weather changes for the better, and then the kids are headed outside and running around. The only way then to, if exercise is going to lower the blood sugar, the way to sort of, again, fill up that gas tank so that you don't run out of sugar is to add some food or carbohydrates to the body. A general rule of thumb we might use is approximately 15 grams for about 20 to 30 minutes of exercise, and so often a 5-year-old might appreciate a little snack if they're going to be running around. If there's intense activity, for example, if they're involved in sporting events, we would encourage extra blood sugar testing to see where they're at. So you could always do an extra blood sugar test and see if they need extra carbohydrates. But that's probably the best way to be flexible, to be responding to the changes in activity. We don't want to tie them down on the couch. We want to keep them active. But for sure, we have to do some extra things to keep a watchful eye on them when they are active. And I would mention that, now it's just the weather here is beautiful. Spring is upon us, and for many people that means more activity, more outside time. And we all often see individuals need a very different insulin regime in different seasons. So if you're more active in the spring and summer, you might need less insulin than you do in the winter. But if you're an intense hockey player and your season is winter, then you might actually need less insulin in the winter months than in the spring and summer months when you're relaxing. So those are some things to take into consideration too, is when the seasons are changing, and that means a change in your activity, perhaps your insulin doses should change a bit as well.
Great, thank you for that response. Our next participant has asked, my son plays sports and games and often doesn't start until after 9 p.m. Should he be checking his blood sugar during the night?
That's a good question as well. And certainly the older the kids get, the later the sports happen, which can be kind of frustrating. So they'll come in from their sport, they'll eat like a meal, and then they're asleep before you know it. So you haven't had any time to evaluate the effect on the blood sugar after the exercise. I don't tell families that it's essential to do middle of the night testing as a rule, but I do often think there's times where that is beneficial, especially with the startup of a new sports season. So say you've got a new basketball season upon you, and what worked last year might not work exactly this year. And so as the season gets started, I might be tempted to do some more frequent testing to see what the blood sugar was before the game, after the game, and then perhaps the middle of the night set an alarm and do so. And then that will allow you to evaluate what's the pattern, what am I seeing? How much did the number drop from, say, 11 p.m. till 3 in the morning? Did that drop by a blood sugar of 5? And if I know that, then I need to know, then that helps me figure out where I need to be when I go to bed. If it dropped by a blood sugar of 10 or more than that, then perhaps we need to think about taking in some extra carbs at bedtime to get the blood sugar up to then compensate for the drop that may be coming in the hours later. It's worth it, the extra testing. I will say that what can be common I'm not sure how old your son is, but sometimes as the kids get up into the teenage years, we can start to see a pretty intense adrenaline response to aggressive or intense exercise. So basketball, hockey as a couple of examples. And that adrenaline response in those intensive sports people will find that the blood sugar rises way high during their game. So they'll start with a reasonable number, and then by the end of the game, they're 20. But it's not really a true blood sugar because it's not produced by food. It's produced by adrenaline. At the end of the sport, essentially your muscles are empty of sugar. And so in the hours that follow, the sugar is kind of soaked up by the empty muscles. And we can see what's happened is sometimes what we call a delayed low blood sugar, where in the next 4 to 6 to 8 hours, that's when the blood sugar drops. It can be quite surprising when this starts to happen, because in the years earlier, I'm sure the parents of the 5-year-old are more in the category where exercise will make the blood sugar come down, and now in these older years, sometimes we have sports that make the blood sugars go higher. So just little tidbits to sort of keep in the back of your mind. And again, if that's your age group and that's your concern, that's a really good discussion to have at your diabetes clinic appointments, going through scenarios when you're changing sports, or if you're finding things that are frustrating you with your sport. I never want diabetes to be the reason someone doesn't play well. So if their blood sugar goes too high in their game and that makes them either not play well or makes them not keep their temper as calm, I don't want that to be from diabetes. And so I would want to work with you to try to figure out how do we get this figured out so that your blood sugar is in a place that it is good for you and good for your sport.
Great. Thanks for that, Julie. Before I move on and take one or two more questions before we tie it up towards the end of the hour, I did want to remind everyone that we are recording today's session, and it will be made available on our diabetes.ca website. And for the questions that we do not get to, please feel free to email us at webinars@diabetes.ca, and between our CDA staff and connecting with Julie, we'd be happy to answer your questions. Another thing is that actually at the bottom of your screen there, you'll see a resource section, and so feel free to download any of those resources right onto your computer. There's some great information on there on type 1 and children on type 1 as well. Our next question, our next participant has asked, what online forums would you suggest, if any?
Online forums, like chat rooms or something?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Honestly, I'm not part of any online forums, so I couldn't even make an honest recommend. I do know I have lots of parents and families who are participating in those. I guess the feedback I've got from families is that you kind of go on, you seek them out, and you find the one that suits you. You have to understand who's posting in those forums. I do think that families living with type 1 diabetes have found incredible support in those forums and chat rooms. For some people, it's the only chance they get to chat with someone who is doing exactly what they're doing every day, and they feel heard and they feel understood, and so that's helpful. Sometimes there are, I know sometimes the information that is given, you have to sort of carefully understand that. So what is the advice of a program in a different country or even a different province? You want to try to understand where that information is coming from. Feel free to discuss that with your own diabetes team to see if the information you're learning about, whether it's new technologies or different treatments or scary things you might be hearing, talk about those with your diabetes team, and they can help you understand them or help you see if they apply to you where you're living or what might be available to you. So sorry, I don't have any good suggestions for that.
That's still a great response there, Julie. Thank you so much for that. Unfortunately, folks, we actually are down to the end of the hour today. So I do want to thank you very much for participating in today's webinar. And I wanted to thank Julie very much for presenting on our webinar today. It's been a very great learning experience, and we're really lucky to have you. I just want to remind you guys that we do have some upcoming webinars for people living with type 1. So next week there will be one on kids in schools. The following week we'll be doing one on transitioning into adulthood from a younger person living with diabetes, And then on the 25th we'll be getting into diabetes burnout. And then June 1st, we'll be ending off our series talking about diabetes and technology, which is the webinar Julie had spoken about earlier. Now, for those of you who are unsure, we do have a DCAMPS program. So we have many camping programs available offered through the CDA, and it's a really great way for teens to be able to, and young youth and adults to be able to meet each other that are kind of going through the same sort of and similar experiences. And so if you're interested or know someone who would be interested, feel free to visit our website, and they can register directly at dcamps.ca. And for those of you living in the Regina area, we do have an expo coming up, which is held on Saturday, May the 14th. And it's a free event for people living with diabetes, so feel free to check it out. And for anyone who has any other diabetes-related questions, feel free to call our 1-800 number. So that's 1-800-BANTING. So 226-8464. We hope you've enjoyed today's webinar, and we look forward to your participation next week. Have a good one.